Hi, welcome for joining us for Future Apprenticeships. This is season 3, episode 5. Today is all about endpoint assessment. Thank you so much for joining us all today. We're live, so if anyone in the audience who's joining us live wants to ask any questions, put any comments in, my co-host Sacha and our guests Chris and Jacqui will be more than happy to answer those, I'm sure. But if you just put those in and if they cannot be an essay, would be great actually, because when it covers your face, it's always a bit weird. And if we could have them before 30 minutes, would be really good too. Today is all about endpoint assessment, and I wonder if I should actually bring in my co-host Sacha, because we've got two really interesting guests, but also a really interesting co-host. So Sacha, I wonder if I could bring you into the studio. Hey Sacha, how are you?
Hi guys.
Well, congratulations as well, because NCFE at the Fab 2022 conference won Endpoint Assessment Organisation of the Year, which is pretty cool, isn't it? So that's like what a co-host to have. Do you know what I mean? So
yeah. So, really proud moment. Was a really proud moment.
Yeah, no, definitely, and I think it's interesting, isn't it? You know, like of where we're at with endpoint assessment, and I know our guests are going to want to chat about these sort of things. We've got one of them who's there from the get-go of working with this, with the Richards review, which is quite interesting. So I've had to see how that sort of progressed and changed a little bit. But I wonder if we could talk about endpoint assessment. What do you see the positive impact that endpoint assessment's brought for learners, for employers, for training providers?
It's a really interesting question, and I think there's some key benefits to endpoint assessment, particularly employers being in the driving seat. I think that is a huge benefit, that they get to influence what the knowledge, skills and behaviours are of the talent that they've got coming through in their industry. They can select the most appropriate assessment methods and that are fit for the industry that they're working in, whether that be an observation, professional discussion, presentation. All of the different variations of assessment at the end are selected by the employers. That's the most appropriate. And I think that is a key benefit that we didn't have before. I think for apprentices, it's an opportunity for them to showcase what they've learned. It's their final hurrah. They've learned all of this knowledge. They've got all of these skills. They know what they're doing. And somebody completely independent who's an industry expert is coming and validating that. Somebody that hasn't been involved before. So it removes any bias. It's absolutely that seal of approval, that confirmation that what they've achieved is validated. And I think that's really powerful. In fact, I think having that complete independence is a real benefit. So it is about that validation, but it's about having those people who are at the forefront of industry who are coming in and making that approval, and they're confirming that that's the right thing for that apprentice, that they've achieved what they need to achieve, and that the employers have that assurance that that talent coming through has got that seal of approval by the right people.
Yeah, no, definitely. I wonder if it's time now to bring in our guests. We've got two epic guests. I'm really, really chuffed that we've had to get both Chris and Jacqui. Jacqui, whenever she writes for an FE News, it is almost guaranteed it's going to be the most popular exclusive article of that week. I mean, this happens all the time. Chris is just got such a rich history in apprenticeships in particular, and he was even involved with the Richards review. I don't know if you remember that at all, but two absolutely epic guests. So Chris, Jacqui, I wonder if I could bring you into the studio. Hey Chris, hey Jacqui, how are you?
Good morning. Good morning. Hi everybody. Hi guest. Thank you for calling it since the beginning, Gab. I might feel really old now. So
Well, it's the beginning of this guise of apprenticeships of where we're at the moment, isn't it? If you know what I mean. And I just think, obviously I had someone the other day say that there's someone who's the founder of Lifelong Learning. I was like, what, are they 200 years old? And like, it's a bit like that with when we're talking about apprenticeships, really. But I mean, where we're at now with I know, Chris, but like, it's this. The Richards Review is really important, and particularly where we're at now. And a lot of the time, I mean, what's that? 10 years, since we the Richards Review as well.
Absolutely, yeah. First draft of that was 2011, and the first Trailblazer group met to discuss, the employee relationship around about this time of year in 2012.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting, isn't it? Of where we're at with apprenticeships and where it's progressing to, really. Sacha, did you want to kick off questions and stuff like that to the guests?
Yes, really thinking about what we've said and we're talking about the benefits. I wonder what your thoughts are on the engagement of providers and employers in endpoint assessment. So we know that we've got Trailblazers who are engaged at the forefront. So that's the group of employers who are engaged at the beginning. But beyond that, when it gets into endpoint assessment of the actual apprentices, what are your thoughts on the engagement of providers and employers in that area?
Well, from my perspective, working with EPAOs, it's come on leaps and bounds. In the very early days, it was very still traditional training provider link, the legacy and history of frameworks and things. There is now a huge amount more engagement with employers and much more proactivity, because to be ready for an apprenticeship, it really for endpoint assessment, it really is about tripartite working, employer, apprentice, endpoint assessment, and it's four-way, isn't it? And the training provider. There are still, I think, some challenges. There are some EPAOs that I work with that are finding that some of the training providers are reluctant to share the details of who the employer is, which is quite intriguing. But also some that have found that when they have engaged with the employer said, my training provider will sort it for you. So there is still a way to go. But if I look back, now compared to when I first started in endpoint assessment 8 years ago, it's come on huge amounts, and there is much more engagement. And I think the employers are seeing how it really, like you were talking about the validation, they're seeing the competencies as a result of the new way of doing things, and then it's really making it relevant to their workplace. And I think that's a big change from historical sort of knowledge-based learning. So.
Yeah, I guess it also depends on the sector. Sectors where it's regulated, like involving, say, for example, the NHS or the MOD, then you're going to get, I think, employers that are going to be quite interventionist at the endpoint assessment level. It needs to be like this, or it must be done in this particular way, or these are the resources that we need to provide. And certainly from the kind of employer Trailblazer group level of employer engagement, again, there are some sectors which only have 2 or 3 employers that you could choose from. So, invite 10, including small ones. Well, there's only 3 or 4. I mean, things like air traffic control, for example, there's 5 or 6 employers across the country, and they're going to have to be the endpoint assessors as well, because you can't, NCFE could say, well, we could recruit air traffic controllers to go and do air traffic control endpoint assessment, but it's not NCFE that's doing it, it's through the arms of someone else. So there's an element of employers having to be involved as well. I mean, employers in terms of their learners and what the learners get out of it. Something like customer service or retail or business administration with such a massive variety of context, it's really difficult to create something which is going to be fit for each of those different purposes. Whereas something that is very, very focused, again, ATC being one of them, very, very kind of focused, it's very clear what the employer can see in this and get out of it and be involved in. So I guess there's a sector bit, and some of those with large volumes where employers might well have 20 different standards in operation in their business, it's very difficult for them to feel like they're engaged in each of those steps, because leaders might be involved, but the actual supervisors and mentors feel out of it being done to them as well. So it's a balancing act. But I agree with Jacqui. Over the last, even last 5 years, taking the COVID bit out of it, the employer engagement has become much more part of it. And certainly the requirement now under the apprenticeship regulations that employers are part of things like progress reviews, I think it's going to push that again a stage further, and remote assessment, and not having to have ceremonial meetings and pulling everybody off of work. I think it's going to just change that dynamic so much, and I think for the better as well.
Yeah,
I agree. Sorry.
Yeah, no, sorry, Sacha. We've had our first question come in. I wonder if I could add that in for everyone. So Ali, thanks a lot for joining us today. And I think basically she's asking with regards to competition. So what's everyone's sort of views on Chris? You sort of touched on it a bit with looking at air traffic control and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, going back to the spirit, again, back to the Richard review, being the old hand here. When I was typing it up, I was saying employers are going to be writing standards, and we're going to have endpoint assessment organizations competing, and BIS at the time were quite sort of let 1,000 flowers bloom was one of their key phrases they used at the time. So it drove a competition. If we have more than one EPAO, it's going to increase the quality because market forces say if you're better. Because at the early stage, what happened was if we've got high pass rates, everyone will come to us. So there's there's kind of moral quality question coming through saying, well, we don't want to make it too easy because everyone will pass, but that means we'll be popular, or make it too hard and we'll have a problem. And we saw that in kind of national qualifications with, exam bodies having an element of that competitive culture. We changed up exam bodies as part of a quality assurance decision. There's elements of that. I think we may have gone too far down the let 1,000 flowers bloom. I mean, having at some point, was it 45 EPAOs? That's not a choice. You go down to geography or to who you know. And it's almost going back to that old Ivy-Evie relationship, was like, who's your chums? And let's chum up to them because they'll do it. It wasn't about quality. It wasn't about price. It wasn't about employers being in control. Because I just hear them say all the time, oh, well, you decide who you work with. So they're abdicating that. I think Jacqui talked about that, abdicating it to the training provider rather than having some control over it ourselves as an employer. So, yeah, I think, and certainly with the rationalization of numbers and the introduction of Ofqual recognition as well, I think it's going to shake out a few of the sort of smaller ones who may not necessarily be niche, but just thinking, well, we'll do this because it's something we can do for an income stream, may just shake out some of those EPAs as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, I like the bringing competition into the market so long as there's the quality with it. So I'm not of a view to sort of move down the road of a single EPAO, because I think the competition and it brings that quality. But there is this point about the consistency of the endpoint assessment, because that's where we have seen issues where the quality of endpoint assessment and is varied, and therefore the consistency is varied. So I think the move to bring Ofqual in as the regulator, controversially as it has been in some cases, actually does bring that consistency to the marketplace. You can argue between quality and consistency, but I do think the move bringing in Ofqual as the regulator is bringing that sort of oversight on that side of the endpoint assessment. So I think with that, I don't see any reason why you shouldn't still have healthy competition with EPAOs. There will be some standards, I suspect, where it will be very difficult to have more than one because it's so specialist, and Chris touched on that. But also maybe like perhaps the apprentice volumes are so small, because that's one of the other challenges with apprenticeship standards, where they have such tiny volumes. It's been difficult to get EPAOs because you've got to balance the income and the financial viability of actually delivering endpoint assessment. So some might only have one simply because it's more philanthropic than it is actually market driven.
Yeah, no, definitely. Sacha.
I agree with all. Yeah, I agree with all of those points. I think that there is something that needs to be done, and we, as endpoint assessment organisations, are responsible for this. Is about collaboration, so that we can collaborate and get a standardised approach. And I think that we've got the standards, we've got the assessment plan, so everything should be running very, very similar, no matter which endpoint assessment organisation you're working with. But I think the service offer behind it is inconsistent, and that makes it really difficult for training providers and employers when they've got multiple apprentices who are working with different endpoint assessment organisations with different systems. So I think there's absolutely something that we as endpoint assessment organisations should do to get that collaboration and working together.
Yeah, no, definitely. Everyone sort of touched on it, but I wonder if we could talk about quality, because I think competition you'd hope should drive quality, but then if you, like as Chris, as you said, if there's absolutely dozens and dozens of people for choice, then it becomes, well, I don't know who to choose, and what do we do? So what do you see, the current challenges of quality in endpoint assessment, but also what future solutions could be? What's the future of quality in endpoint assessment? Jacqui.
Oh, throw it straight at me. Well, I think quality, is very much driven by making sure that the customer's at the forefront of what you're doing.
Yep.
Because I think that can be lost sometimes. And actually, if you look at Ofqual, their focus is always on protection of the learner. So it's about making sure you've got that service. But you've also got to make sure you've got very close adherence to the standard and the assessment plan. I know sometimes I feel like I'm banging my drum on that, but I have seen times where there are EPAOs that have not been fully adhering to the assessment plan, but the assessment plan and the standard are there for a reason. You should be following them. Yes, there are quirks. We all know there's quirks in some of them. We know there's some grey areas, so you will get variations. But I think bringing in that consistency and adherence to the rules and the standards and the assessment plans is actually what will drive that quality. And then having joined up working, like Sacha mentioned, to actually address where there are those fuzzy areas or quirks, whether there's something in the assessment plan that isn't right, or something that doesn't work. I mean, there's EPAOs where they've done assessments where it's been given 60 minutes. The reality's turned out that it's physically impossible to cover all the KSPs in a 60-minute period. So these things can be worked through, but that's where the collaborative work, I think, can come in, and hopefully potentially with the role of the EQA provider, because they should be gathering that information from the EPAOs to then be able to filter it back out to bring that consistency to it. Because I think historically it's been a bit hodgepodge. If your approach, it seems to work, okay, stick with that. Another EPA, your approach seems to work as well, stick with that. And that's where you get the difficulty in that they both are quite possibly very high quality approaches, but there isn't the consistency. So I think that collaboration and sharing, but making sure you're adhering to the rules and regulations and the assessment plan and standard, will help drive that quality.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. Chris, any thoughts?
Yeah, I suppose to go back to the original intention of endpoint assessment and the quality decision. So the employer groups, the trailblazer groups, were asked to write assessment plans with no training, no support. I mean, support came from the network. So I remember going around, funded by the Federation, FIS as it was at the time, to help EPAOs and trailblazer groups understand what multiple choice was about, or practical assessment. And what's happened in the, we supposed to have 100 occupational standards, and that was it. So Matt Hancock, remember him, jumped on stage and said there'll only be 100 occupations. Don't want 2,000 standard frameworks turned into standards. Of course, we've gone almost back the other way. So employer group says, I want to have an interview, but I want it to feel like an interview. Let's call it a professional discussion. And they say you must ask the following 10 questions. So suddenly, as Jacqui said, there are quirks, but it's more than quirks. There's some hard-baked bad practice in some of the endpoint assessment plans, because the employer groups who created them aren't experts in that area. And Ofqual and ESFA and IFA, of course, in latter years, are having to try and deal with that. So I think there does need to be a bit of a kind of narrowing down of the range and the interpretation of what an assessment should be. And then we can start to build quality on top, because NCFE's interpretation of professional discussion with 10 themes or 10 questions, you have to write a bank, is probably not going to be the same as A and others. But NCFE and A and other are not required to come together and standardize their approaches under an Ofqual banner, because we're in competition. So you're kind of building in requirement for quality, but not allowing quality systems to operate. And if you did, well, we don't want to give our crown jewels away about how we operate our wonderful endpoint assessment. We're endpoint assessment organization of the year. Why would we want to tell you that? And I know you're collaborative, Sacha, I know you are, but it does feel like you're kind of forcing things into the wrong place. And the other side of quality, well, who's the arbiter of that? So Ofqual, protect the learner, make sure that these things are rigorous, because any appeals and complaints can go all the way through to His Majesty, because it's public examinations. It's a DFE route. It isn't, it used to be, which is the buck will stop at the examination organisation or the awarding organisation. It goes way beyond that. And I do adjudications on complaints and things, the next step of which goes off the DFE. So there's that bit of quality, but we haven't got the resource to do all those different facets all the time, because there's so many different ways of working. So I guess there's going to be a little bit of, not rationalization is the wrong word, but I think consolidation of practice to at least give us, everyone's clear that when you do a multiple choice question and the pass mark 60%, then that means that if you get 61%, you have achieved something, but 59 means you haven't. And that's really hard to do. Across so many different types of standards and the way that they're put together.
I think one of the other points on quality as well, from the customer side, the employer, training provider, and even apprentice side, when it comes to endpoint assessment, there's no there's no ability for them to understand the quality of the EPAOs. So in the training provider world, they have the Ofsted and they get grades. In the endpoint assessment world, there's nothing visibly in the public domain to tell a customer what the quality is of those EPAOs beyond what the EPAOs are saying themselves. So I do think there's a gap there in terms of, if you want employers to make choice, then you need to give them the means to be able to make an informed choice. Especially the comment you made earlier about who knows who, you pick that EPAO because you know them and they're mates of. Well, if you don't give them a mechanism to make a choice by benchmarks of quality, for example, then how can they make an effective and informed choice about the appropriate EPAO to use?
And we had a really good point. Yeah, we had a, sorry to interrupt, I had a piece of work around that funded by Biz at the time to do a kind of TripAdvisor type rating system, but it got battered by the network because, who's to say that's the right quality measure? Yeah. Or if we come out badly, what's our right of appeal? And you've misunderstood. So it actually becomes really difficult to do because it's so varied. It's not a hotel with a restaurant and a bar, things everybody recognizes. These are very nuanced quality measures about the conduct, and it became down to, well, we didn't get our result until day 30 and you promised it was 10. It's not as horrendous because other people have a service standard of 15 days, so you actually would have been better than that. So on that quality measure, you've done really well. On that one, you've picked it really bad. So it's so difficult to do because it's just so much stuff going on in the quality world.
Sasha, anything you want to add? I've seen you come on and off on mute a few times.
Yes, actually, on that point about selecting the endpoint assessment organisations and the benchmark, I find it really interesting when I see endpoint assessment organisation using their success rates as a tool to attract people, because the achievement rates are not the endpoint assessment organisation's achievement rates. And it's almost like they're saying, come to us because you're more likely to pass, which then actually takes away the quality of the assessment. That's not a benchmark of an endpoint assessment organisation because they have a 96% achievement rate or success rate. That's actually the providers. It's the apprentices achieved that. They've achieved that. And the providers have given the teaching and learning, and the employers have supported that. I find that really interesting, that that's a benchmark that many endpoint assessment organisations I see advertised. And it's something that I absolutely put my foot down in NCFE, is that that's not our achievement rates. So we use other measures to encourage people to come to us. And I think the quality and the standardisation of endpoint assessment organisations is something that we're crying out for, and we need that. And we need that to be able to provide the best service to the providers and the employers. And I think that's really key for the future.
Yeah, no, definitely. I wonder if we could move on to something else around quality. I know, Jacqui, this is something you mentioned to me when we were sort of planning out, ideas for topics to cover on the show around bundling. I wonder if you could, for those who don't know, maybe you can explain what we're talking about with bundling, because we don't want to assume, and then and why do we need to talk about that? Right. I think that's really important for people.
Okay, it's just something I wanted to cover because it's something I'm seeing a lot, and I do feel it's distorting the market in some way. There is a rule for endpoint assessment organisations that you're not allowed to do packaging, I suppose. You're not allowed to bundle prices together. So, for example, if you do endpoint assessment with us, we'll give you a discount on a qualification over here, or we'll give you free membership to X. It's against the ESFA conditions for EPAOs. What is happening is it's happening quite a lot across the endpoint assessment sector, whereby endpoint assessment organisations are saying, if you buy endpoint assessment with us, we'll give you X or Y or Z. And ESFA have repeatedly put messages about this. I'm still seeing it happen, and I speak to a lot of EPAOs, and I am seeing a direct impact where they're losing business, and the final crux of that decision has been, well, I get an extra X from this organisation. And if you make a decision not to use an EPAO for quality purposes for other things, fine, but it's to me, it's a rule that's there. You might disagree with it, but I think if it's a rule that people disagree with, they should lobby ESFA to change the rule. They shouldn't decide to ignore the rule because they don't like it. So it's something I'm quite passionate about because I've seen it, and I've seen the direct impact it is having on other EPAOs where they're saying you can get X and Y. So basically, it's really, I just wanted to raise it so that it's there. It's a rule, and everyone needs to play ball and adhere to that rule. Because it's if the point is about a fair marketplace, it is effectively distorting the marketplace. So it's a little bit of a bee in my bonnet, I'm afraid. But I did want to raise it.
Well, I think Chris, I know you obviously want to add to that.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I spend a lot of time writing policy, and there's a compendium of words that you use in policy, but I've never seen stronger language than the policy around this specific collusion. Instead, you are prohibited from collusion in this way, and bundling is the kind of the manifestation of that.
Yeah.
Because ESFA at the time, obviously IFA, were so concerned with exactly that. You're making the wrong choices based on the wrong economic measure. Yes, you can be cheaper, and therefore you choose on price and quality, but the quality bit is so difficult to identify. And Sacha, you're absolutely right. Success rates, in fact, success rates are the least useful measure, because I can make anybody's endpoint assessment so blasted easy that everyone gets through, and no one's really competent, because you can write
that quality.
Yes. Write multiple choice questions that ask you the capital of France is Timbuktu, and it's obviously Paris. Anybody can do that and get you 80% and get you distinctions, but you're not competent. And so that competent versus quality question is one of those that's always going to gnaw at us until we bring EPAOs on and they're required under the regulated element to collaborate on driving up quality. And they're not going to want to do that collectively, because it might impact on price and bundling and quality and everything else. And that's why that kind of language was so direct. And I hadn't seen policy papers that were quite as blunt as that, thinking, blimey, specifically prohibited. Government people don't write stuff like that. Even in sanctions against other countries, you don't write stuff like that. And so it was as intemperate as I've seen any policy wording on this one.
We're getting really close to the end, but I wanted to. This is touching, actually. I think all of this is moving to the marketplace and speed of change. Do you know what I mean? So, like, I think we've mentioned a few times around the employer. Do they know that they got choice, and do they know things around like bundling could be tempting? Do you know what I mean? But do they know they shouldn't be sort of stepping into that? What do you see, like, just really quickly around the speed of change in endpoint assessment and the way the marketplace is going? Jacqui.
I think, just to sort of sum up, I think over the next 6 months to a year, we're still going to be quite turbulent with the embedding in of Ofqual and the cut-off point. So I think we're still going to be turbulent for the next 6 to 12 months in terms of making sure there's coverage and the learners have transitioned to the EPAOs that are recognised. But I think beyond that, I think the future for me is bringing that consistency. If we can get the consistency, then that will also complement and drive up quality.
Cool. Chris, how about you?
Yeah, I think I'll take a different angle then. I agree with Jacqui. Take a different angle that some assessment plans and standards are not responsive to the dynamic change of business. And certainly the way we're doing business now, the type of ignoring the political environment that we work in, we obviously can't ignore that. But, technology changes, the way we work with overseas partners changes, the way that we use business practice, the economics of running business because of taxation, everything else changes. Means I've got to do things slightly differently, and the standard and assessment plans will automatically lag behind. And the more bureaucratic you make that about being able to change things, the harder it will be. And then you also lose the quality, because you bring in things that have not been as rigorously thought through. Suddenly you've introduced a problem, and that becomes a consistency problem. So I guess I would say yes on the consistency, but also the ability to move faster in updating and amending current practices. Things like remote assessment even through COVID, took ages to agree that remote assessment could be done. And there's so many strictures on that. Is there a way to actually be better with this form of remote assessment? You know who you're talking to right now. I know who I'm talking to right now. We can see that's obvious. And there's ways, Procter and everything else can do that. But to make it face-to-face and robust, and it doesn't always work in some sectors. Without dropping the quality, is there a way to think differently about the conduct of assessment?
Yeah, no, definitely. We're at the close. We've got like about 30 seconds left. It's gone like a blink of an eye. If you could have one thing that you want to see for the future of assessment, what would it be, Chris?
I would say compact down this vast range of assessment stuff that's out there. Let's agree a kind of a handbook of something a little bit more compact, so that we at least understand what it is we're assessing, because I want competence assessments to actually assess competence, not stuff. That's for me.
Yeah, no, that's really cool, actually. Jacqui, what would you want for your one thing?
Stability. I think we've been such a tumultuous period for the last 2 or 3 years with the changes going on. I think just bringing stability so that people can actually start to understand and go with the flow. And then, but I do totally agree with Chris's point about the ability to be responsive, because the job market is very dynamic, so we need to be able to be responsive to that as well.
Yeah, definitely. Sacha, what would you want to see if you could have one thing for the future of EPA?
Consistency would absolutely be what I would want. Consistency of delivery, consistency of assessment plans, consistency across everything. So everybody was absolutely clear of what was required and the apprentices were getting the best no matter who was delivering.
Yeah, no, really cool. Well, we're at that time. It's we're over, but I thought it was a really good show. Thank you so much, Sacha, for helping me with the questions and bringing everyone together. Jacqui and Chris, I knew he was going to have a good show and you both were on, so thank you for joining us. This is a total collaboration between co-produced and everything with NCFE, so I just want to say massive thank you to Sam, to Elliot and Lindsay. Thank you for helping everything get this together, and Sacha with all the different ideas with the show, so thank you. Also Team FE News, thank you to Finley, thank you to Holly, thank you to Danielle for your apprentices talking about the future of apprenticeships, which is never a bad thing really. Next week is actually a very last show of this episode and season. I feel a little bit weird about it, to be honest with you. So join us next week for episode 6, and it's a good one. It's all around looking at having a culture of collaboration. I mean, what could be better for the future of apprenticeships if we're not looking at how we work collaboratively? We talked about it already a couple of times today with endpoint assessment. So thank you everyone for joining us today. It'd be really lovely to see you next week at 10 a.m. on Thursday the 24th. And thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next week. Bye.
Thanks everyone. Bye.